So we'll create a stand-in that will load with a .ass file, which will be the environment. And if I wanted to actually see the environment, you could do that through the stand-in node by dropping down your viewport draw mode to something called shaded. You can also select something like a wireframe or the poly wire or something like a point cloud or something like a shaded poly wire. So once you get your reference geometry visible, you can see that there's quite a bit of aliasing on this, and we can actually fix that by turning on anti-aliasing, so that works on your stand-ins as well. And let's turn off the grid also. Under Arnold, let's go ahead and create another stand-in, and that stand-in will be my truss ceiling, if you will. If you still needed to go in and actually make adjustments in terms of where it sits, go ahead and just reposition this to exactly where I want it. And then maybe I want to go in and create something like a sky dome light, so we can render this in the context of the environment and not just the truss ceiling by itself. So let's go ahead and render that. So in this case, you could see that we get the illumination to come in and illuminate the environment, the hangar, quite nicely. I can also go into my sky dome and load a file texture that is an HDR that I'd like to open. So under source images, I have an HDR folder where I might want to find something like this curved hull. It has a lot of blue tones in it, and so as soon as I open that up, you can see that it starts to bring in that color temperature. And if I go back to my sky dome, I can crank it up to like an exposure of 2, for example. So we can use sky domes this way. We can also replace that sky dome with something like a photometric light, so unique light characteristics for lights can be specified through IES files, through photometric files. And so in this case, what I'd like to do is maybe get rid of that sky dome, and let's stop the render there for a second, and create a photometric light. And there's that photometric light. I'm going to move this up above the truss ceiling and load an IES file. So up here I have a folder of IES profiles, and there's 30 there that all work. I also downloaded a whole bunch of them from like Philips and from like Ametrix or Lumiere, Metalux. They all have their own light profiles, .ies files that can be downloaded and used in 3D scenes like this. So the one I'm going to use here is number 23. So let's go ahead and load that. And as soon as I start up the render again, you'll see that nothing really shows up, and that's because we don't really have much of an exposure or light intensity. So I'm going to set the light intensity to something like 10, and maybe the exposure to something like 8, and now we actually get something to show up in the render. If we get a little closer, you can also see that the shadows that are being cast, because I have that IES light sitting above the truss ceiling, are very harsh and very black. And so if you wanted to fix that, you can select your photometric light and maybe lighten up the shadow color a bit, making it a little more transparent. But you can also go in here and fix the radius, for example. You can set this to like 0.3. You can see that we get much softer kind of rendering of the shadow across all your surfaces. There might be some noise in there, and so you would want to fix that through the sampling value in here. That's set to 1. You might want to crank that up to 2 or 3. And so this is unique for the light, whereas all the other sampling values for Arnold rendering can be found under Arnold Renderer. And you can see in this case we have this set to 3 and all 2s, the default values. And I'm going to drop this down a little bit more to speed that up even more. Okay, so once that's done, let's go ahead and make this shadow color a little bit lighter. I'm going to set the radius to 0, and that's really because I want to introduce something like an atmospheric light, and or an atmospheric node. Under environment, we can create under atmosphere an AI atmosphere volume node. And so once that's brought in, I'm going to crank this up just a little bit. And the reason why I set the radius on the lights to 0 is because when you have the radius set to 0 and it's a true point light, you're starting to see all these God rays in your scene, which are cast shadows through a volumetric effect like an atmosphere as this truss system is just kind of generating these shadows. One of the things I might want to do is give this a little bit of a color temperature by just simply selecting a color like this, and then maybe go in here and increase the attenuation as well. So the attenuation isolates the atmospheric effect to where there is light intensity. So when it sees light intensity, it will actually maintain the same atmospheric density. Where it doesn't, it kind of drops it, and so it really emphasizes the God ray effect. You can see they're a little easier to see right now. Let's go ahead and maybe increase the density to like 0.02. And now I do want to go to my photometric effect and give it a little bit of a radius, like 0.2, to soften all of that up just a bit. The next thing I'd like to do is maybe change the material on the stand-in that we created. So let's pause this for a second, and I'm going to move up here and take a look at this truss ceiling. Render this out. Let's go ahead and restart the render. Let's turn on 3D manipulation. Let's get a little closer and drop the intensity of that exposure to maybe something like 4. So to assign shaders to stand-ins, you can override what the material is on that stand-in simply by assigning a new shader. So if we create a new shader, AI standard surface shader, and then select a preset, all of these presets ship with the software, and then below the double line right here are all presets that I've created. And so one of the ones that I've created is called silver, and if I select silver, you can see that now it generates this silverish looking metallic aluminum truss system. That's all good. Let's stop this and reposition the camera. I'd like to now copy this across so we have more than just one. So let's grab the stand-in, let's grab the IES node, and let's move it over so that they meet right there, and one more time. So now we have them covering pretty much the entire ceiling, as well as having a few more of these IES nodes. Let's move them over a little closer to the camera. So let's re-render this, restart up IPR, and you'll see that the intensity I dropped because of I wanted to actually get a close-up of that silver material on the truss system. So let's go ahead and increase the exposure on this to something like 5 or 6, up from 4, maybe 7, something like that. And you can see now we get a better coverage. We get more light in the scene, and we get a full coverage on the ceiling there. So that's kind of most of what the workflow is on generating a ceiling like this. Now I'd like to go in and maybe put these lights inside so we get an illumination that reflects off the ground and illuminates the ceiling that might look a little better. So let's go ahead and stop this render one more time and zoom out. We'll grab these 3 lights, move them below the truss system, truss ceiling if you will, and then move them over. We'll rotate this, let's say 40 degrees, and move this up just a little bit more, and then we'll duplicate them to the other side, roughly right there. We'll rotate this negative 40 degrees. And so right now I have all these lights pointing towards the center of this hanger, and we get something that looks a little more like this. Now let's zoom in a bit, get a little closer, push the camera into this scene as it renders. You can see these lights are a little too bright because I have twice the number of lights, and I have them also much closer to all these surfaces without casting any shadows through that truss ceiling. So I want to go ahead and select all of them and drop the intensity a bit by, let's say we'll make it 5 or 6, maybe 6. 5.5, something in between. This will work. So this is essentially how we can set up an environment like this, and maybe I want to drop the atmosphere a bit, but I do want to, or maybe not, I do want to add an element, kind of an object of interest like a jet. I have all these jets, these dreadnoughts jets, saved off as .as files, so we can simply create a stand-in, and then with that stand-in, let's go ahead and stop this real quick. So here are the .as files for the Eurojet, for the green jet, the prototype, and the red jet with the black stripes. I'm going to load the prototype. And so once that's loaded, we can move this up. I just need the volume. Maybe scale this down just a bit and rotate this towards the camera. And let's see how high this sits. Something like this. And then we can drop into a top view real quick and maybe move this towards the center of our scene, and then back to a perspective view where we can restart the render and get a sense of what that jet looks like in the environment. And so that's kind of how we can test and get the feedback to speed up the workflow and make creative decisions quickly. So as I let this render, you can see that it starts to bring in all the detail. The lights are essentially pointing down. There's no direct illumination really that occurs on this truss ceiling from these photometric lights. So the photometric lights are essentially shining down. Light is being bounced around and hits the ceiling to illuminate it and make it show up. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.